أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. خلال الحملة الانتخابية قدم دونالد ترامب الكثير من الوعود، وفي الشهر الأول من إدارته الجديدة كان منشغلا بتنفيذها. كانت هناك وعود بشأن العفو، ووعود بشأن الهجرة، ووعود بشأن الانفاق الحكومة، ووعود بشأن التعريفات الجمركية. كانت هناك وعود بالقضاء على الأفكار التقدمية في الحكومة، ووعود بجعل بعض الإجراءات التبعية أو تكلفة. ماذا يمكننا أن نتبين من الشهر الأول لإدارته؟ أي الوعود كانت الأكثر أهمية؟ ماذا يمكننا أن نعرف عن أولويات الرئيس؟ وماذا يمكننا أن نتعلم من رد فعل الشعب الأمريكي على الطريقة التي ينفذ بها وعوده؟ لمناقشة جدول أعمال الرئيس بعد شهر من عودته إلى المكتب البيضاوي، يسعدني أن أرحب بضيوف من الخبراء السياسيين كايل كونديك ورافي بيري وتود جيلمان. Welcome to Dakhel, Washington. It has been a wild roller coaster, and it's only 6 weeks in. I'm talking about Donald Trump's second term in the White House. We're going to talk about what has happened, the ups, the downs, the ins, the outs. I'm delighted to welcome Tod Gilman, Kyle Kondik. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen. Has there ever been as consequential a first 6 weeks of an administration as we've seen in the early days of Trump 2, Todd?
Not in my memory that I'm aware of, no. I mean, it's just the pace of change when Trump is president was staggering during his first term, and it is staggering times 10 now.
So let's go through some of this. Kyle, other than the earliest hiccup with Matt Gaetz, the president's first nominee to be Attorney General, everyone he has wanted to serve in his cabinet it seems to be getting Senate confirmation. Did you expect this?
Look, I think Trump made some, frankly, kind of weak, controversial choices. I'd say Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense is that way, but ultimately there were enough Republican senators who wanted to be deferential to the White House, and so some of these, I mean, you think about like a Secretary of Defense appointment, you would think that would be an appointment that would, get wide bipartisan support. But of course, it required a tiebreaker, even though the Republicans have 53 seats in the Senate. There have been a number of other kind of nail biters. Hegseth kind of stands out, in that regard. But ultimately, you've got a Republican Senate that is pretty deferential to Donald Trump, in part because I think they're afraid of Donald Trump, or they're afraid of their own voters who like Donald Trump.
I mean, usually, Todd, senators like to flex their muscles a little bit and claim a measure of prerogative. I mean, for many of them, it'll be 4 or 6 years until they're up for election again. Were you surprised that we didn't have more pushback from some of the Republican senators?
I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but I think for the next 4 years, you need to stop prefacing questions with usually, because there's no such thing as usually anymore. In Trump world, all bets are off. Yes, the conventional wisdom and the traditional political dynamic of checks and balances has told us, has suggested that senators and members of the House as well jealously guard their prerogative. Their prerogatives, the Congress has the power of the purse, and the Senate has the power of advice and consent when it comes to cabinet nominees and other nominees. But they just want to roll over and have their bellies scratched by this president. There are hardly any members of the Senate who are willing to stand up. and defy President Trump. One of them is Mitch McConnell, the former Republican leader in the Senate, who is retiring. There's literally nothing for him to lose. We see a little bit of pushback from a couple of the traditional, the people who have often pushed back and been a bit maverick, Senator Collins from Maine, Senator Murkowski from Alaska, but you also have seen them go along with some of the more controversial picks as well. And except for Matt Gaetz, who was just so beyond the pale that even most senators couldn't stomach that. You've seen Kash Patel confirmed as the FBI director. This is a person who has explicitly said that the Trump administration, if put into power, should prosecute, investigate people who were just enforcing the law during the Biden administration. So all bets are off. There's no usual anymore.
All right. Well, we're joined by Ravi Perry. Glad to have you with us, Ravi. Kyle, you mentioned the Secretary of Defense nominee, now confirmed, Pete Hegseth. There was a huge late Friday shift at the Department of Defense with the dismissal of some of the most senior American military officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chief of naval operations. How usual is this sort of change in administrations, and is there a rationale that was ascribed to this decision?
Look, I'm not an expert on the Pentagon, so I can't speak from historical perspective about it. I did read about it, of course, and a lot of people who do cover the Pentagon thought that it was pretty unusual. It also continues a trend with this administration of doing making a lot of big moves over the weekend or late at night on Friday. We sometimes joke about like a Friday night news dump, and this administration just does it all the time. And there's executive orders coming out, and so there are certain things that I think they want to do that maybe they don't want to get covered as much, but of course they are going to get covered. But it also contributes to the kind of news being kind of like a fire hose, with this administration. That there's just really been a lot going on and a lot to digest over just less than the 2 months of this new administration.
And Ravi, the fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is African American, the chief of naval operations is the first woman in this position. How is this being interpreted more broadly?
Well, I think it's being interpreted by most people as racism and the opposite of what they're hearing from the White House, which is alleged meritocracy. When you replace a more qualified black general with a less qualified, more recent general, well, that's the opposite of meritocracy. When you do a DEI purge of all of federal agencies, and without doing an actual cut by cut basis, like they say a lot, with a scalpel versus, a chainsaw, then, what you've seen is a lot of errors being replaced. And the challenge, though, is that whether or not people see this. And so I happen to watch a lot of media because of the kind of work that I do. But, when I turn on certain networks, they're not even covering the fact, of a budget deal that's going to cost people trillions of dollars. They're not even covering the fact that, there was an error in this department and that department, and this email sent out and that email sent out, and these people fired and then rehired all across the board in the CIA and national security and national parks. And it looks suspicious, I think, to most Americans, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, but particularly if you are a Democrat and independent. It looks suspicious when you're just firing people at whim and you're telling people rhetorically, oh, it's all about the budget, it's all about the budget, and yet we see no numbers. The data that's on the Doge X page is constantly pulled and edited upon news vetting. And so we don't actually have real information. But, in the absence of I think most people watching news industries that they believe they can trust the information where it's coming from, people aren't really, I think, looking for that data anymore. So that's what I think is the advantageous position of the Trump administration, is that if you can continue to obfuscate people into thinking that you're doing for them, even though you are literally doing the exact opposite, then it still works.
So, Todd, Ravi just mentioned it, DEI, which is an acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was an early presidential directive about this. And now we're getting the implementation of that directive. What did the president order, and how is it being carried out throughout the administration?
The executive order required all federal agencies to erase any vestiges of DEI policy or funding, which has had an enormous trickle-down effect to universities and researchers around the country, because all of the grants, science grants, that you wouldn't think are implicated in an order like this are getting pulled. We've looked at, my news organization is a university-based news organization at Arizona State. We've looked at grants for things like wildfire research and climate research, and the impact of pollution on lower income communities. So environmental justice issues about poor people who often are non-white live next to toxic waste sites. Well, that implicates diversity, and funding for that is being pulled. Cancer research and how different drugs react differently with female patients or white or black or Hispanic or Asian patients. The funding for this is being pulled. So there are implications within the federal agencies where people have been fired or put on administrative leave pending being dismissed, presumably, because they were engaged in training on how to be nice to your coworkers, how to be nice to the public, and be sensitive to cultural differences. And then we're seeing this whole level of ripple effects that I don't think most Americans knew that's what they were voting for. People who supported Trump certainly understood and wanted, a lot of them, they liked this rhetoric about, changing the culture in Washington and making the bureaucrats uncomfortable and all of that. But the wholesale destruction of the technocratic apparatus that has always served the American people through one president and then the next, regardless of party. Climate scientists, weather forecasting, cancer researchers, all of this, public health has been hit very hard. It's astonishing.
So those are the cuts that are connected to DEI. There's a whole separate, although connected, series of cuts under the big category of waste, fraud, and abuse. We'll get to that in a bit. But you raised the question, Todd, of is this what the American people thought that they were going to get? So, Kyle, how popular is this shift? How popular is the idea of all these cuts under the categories that Todd just described?
There's a famous description of the American public by political scientists, this goes back decades, that they're sort of symbolically conservative, but maybe like specifically liberal. And so in the abstract, I think the idea of cutting the size of government is pretty popular. And I mean, people ask people about it. That sort of idea polls pretty well. And Trump's approval rating, though declining, is still better than it was, certainly at this point in his first presidency. His approval rating is still net positive, meaning that his approval rating is a little bit higher than his disapproval. Although again, presidents usually start with some level of kind of a honeymoon period in approval polling, and the numbers for Trump have generally been downward. But it's not like he's super unpopular or something. He's doing better on that front than he did in his first term. But once you start to maybe get to some of the specifics of what's being cut, or if there are effects that people notice from the cuts, and again, that's a story that's going to take months and years to write, that's when I think it starts to become more of a political problem for Trump and for Republicans. Of course, Trump's not on the ballot in 2026. He's not allowed to run for re-election as president in 2028 based on the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution. But Republicans who are kind of deferring to Trump on a lot of these things and deferring to Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who's been almost made kind of like a prime minister in some ways on this government cutting effort. They've decided to defer to him. But if there's a political price to be paid, the Republicans in the House and Senate, particularly those in vulnerable seats, are going to be the ones that pay the price for it.
All right, we're going to come back and continue this conversation about the implications of budget cuts and employment cuts and the popularity in the first 6 weeks of the Trump administration in just a moment. Again, welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm here with Ravi Perry, Todd Gilman, and Kyle Kondik to discuss the first 6 weeks of the Trump administration. Ravi, in addition to all those DEI cuts, the administration has suspended all grants, has effectively suspended the U.S. Agency for International Development, has effectively put out of business the Consumer Financial Protection Board, two government agencies which are a bit obscure probably for most Americans, but yet they're beginning to hit things that will touch many Americans. How close are we to touching programs that are going to hit tens of millions of Americans? Social Security, Medicare, for example.
Well, we're very close. I mean, just the budget package passed by the House Republicans certainly ensures that will happen. The way that they're claiming that it's not is again through rhetoric, but the budget package requests like $800 billion be found via the one federal agency that oversees Medicaid, and the only way you're going to find that a large amount of money is in the largest entitlement programs, which is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Programs that are very popular, programs that my aunts and mother are living off of, and without that money, they would be functionally dead. And millions of Americans like me share that same story. Wherever we're not for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, they're elderly ones, which is, of course, the majority of American voters, the majority of much of the country now, as we are living older, would not simply be alive. And so, unless Republicans want to see what the streets looks like in the Great Depression, which caused the need for those programs to be created to begin with, they're going to need to find a way to change course and do so very quickly. These stories coming out from the news are bothering Americans of all kinds, because federal workers are not just here in the DMV Beltway; they're all over the country, and millions of them are losing their jobs or their contracts or their probationary work, whatever you want to call it, but their federal engagement that they were doing and getting paid for is now all gone, and there's poor communication, if any communication at all. And then on the public health front, I was mentioned, which is very important, we've stopped funding for HIV care, which is really catastrophic. I mean, not only in terms of our global witness in the rest of the world and how we help care for a equity around health access for those with HIV around the world, but here in the United States, there are millions of people who are affected by this, and that is, going to be a real concern. I saw a story just this week that insulin went up from $6 for someone in my native Ohio to now over $80, simply because Trump rescinded the American Recovery Plan Act in one of his executive orders. And so the cost on millions of people, as you asked, is already hitting home. The problem is it may not have exactly hit a paycheck or hit their job immediately, but everyone at this point, certainly that I know, is at least 1 degree separation away from somebody who they know has already been hurt by this.
So that's the question I want to pursue. Todd, How close are we getting to the administration hurting, or at least having their cuts affect Trump voters?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between short-term domestic policy implications and cuts, and maybe some of the long-term investments that Ravi has already alluded to.
So, but my question is as much politics as it is policy, which is, Kyle, when, if at all, do these cuts begin to come up against the coalition that put Donald Trump into the White House?
Well, look, I mean, if you just go across congressional districts across the country, I mean, look at, one of the kind of poorest regions of the United States, Appalachia, stretching from Western New York all the way down to Mississippi and Alabama. Outside of the cities that are covered by Appalachia, some of the big cities like Pittsburgh, for instance, Republicans control basically all of those congressional districts along that, in that region. And there are lots of people on Medicaid, for instance, which is, assistance, healthcare assistance for, lower income people. If you really do slash those programs, there are going to be people all over the country who are hurt by it. People who voted for Kamala Harris, people who voted for Donald Trump, people who didn't vote at all. And, people, young people too, of course. So that, again, and that's maybe more of a longer term sort of thing, but I can tell you this, I mean, the Democrats are in sort of retreat after the 2024 election, but one of the issues where Democrats have consistently held an advantage over Republicans has been on healthcare. And if you see Republicans just slash Medicaid spending in order to, basically, continue the tax cuts that we saw in 2017, that's about as easy of a message for Democrats to try to run on as you could think of, really. It's up to Democrats to actually perform in the elections coming up in 2025 and 2026. But that's really a tailor-made issue. And so, when it comes to the House and the Senate actually figuring out what they're going to do with the budget and these tax cuts, the members in vulnerable seats are really going to have to think hard about what that vote could mean for them and for their careers.
We only have a few seconds left. Let me ask you very, very briefly, Ravi, what in your view is the most consequential thing the president has done over the last 6 weeks that hasn't got the attention that it deserved?
Well, I think his effort to slash the 14th Amendment and end birthright citizenship has gotten some attention, but not nearly enough. This is extremely dangerous. If we allow any executive to try to unilaterally take a chainsaw to the United States Constitution, that we really are functioning no longer a democratic republic, which is what Democrats have argued for the last several years in this election. But that to me proves it.
All right, birthright citizenship. And Todd, what would be on your list?
I'm gonna go with the gutting of the White House press pool, which is a little bit obscure, but the White House is now deciding which journalists get to be in the royal presence and ask questions of the president. And they have used the wedge that they've used for this is the renaming of that big body of water that for 400 years has been known as the Gulf of Mexico. And the Associated Press, which serves millions of readers around the world, has declined to go along. And the White House has punished them. This is a test case of whether President Trump can decide whether independent news media can be around him and serve the public interest.
And that's coming from a former official of the White House Press Association. All right, we have to call it there. I want to thank you all very much, Kyle Kondik, Ravi Perry, and Todd Gilman, for helping explain these first consequential weeks of the Trump administration to our viewers abroad. Thank you for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. بهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، خاصة فيما يتعلق بأهم أولويات الرئيس ترامب، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج InsideWashington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. سنلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.